Hello, everyone, and welcome to Growing Together, a gardening podcast with me, former reporter John Lamb, and Don Kinzler, a lifelong gardener and the North Dakota State University Extension horticulturist for Cass County. Don, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Always great to be here.
Well, it's good to have you back, and it's always good to talk about gardening. And I think we should talk about gardening for almost from the beginning, or as far as planning gardens, like what things to do to, we're looking forward to gardening and we want to see the results and the output, but how do we go about planning that? And I wanted to see what are some things that people should consider when they're planning, and whether it's a new garden or they've taken the old garden and they're going to totally redo it. What are some things that people should consider?
Well, any of us with a yard or space, no matter how big, how small, many of us are not totally satisfied. Sometimes you've got a new area, blank canvas, and so you can start from scratch. But many of us have something existing already, but it isn't always the way we'd like it to look. But maybe you do like the looks of it. You can always keep adding to. So there are some definite things that a person should look at. Now, the tricky part is, oftentimes we have in our head an idea kind of how we would like it to look. Maybe you've looked in a gardening magazine or some websites, and you have an idea like, man, I wish my yard looked like that, in Fine Gardening magazine. But we don't always know how to get it from that kind of loose idea into actually making our yard or space look like that. But there are some kind of definite key points that a person can look at. But now this also brings up the interesting topic about, and we talked about this a little bit last time, the term garden.
Right.
Garden. Now, of course, when I grew up, and you mentioned this too, John, when we used to say garden, it was vegetables. That was a place where you grew the broccoli and potatoes.
Yep.
But now, of course, in Europe, for centuries, the garden was a mixture of flowers, perennial flowers, shrubs, landscaping, trees. It was their yard. It was their landscape. And so more and more now in this country, in this region, we're thinking of the garden as not just vegetables, but we're thinking of the garden as more like our yard, our landscape. And so that's maybe the more common connotation now of the garden. It's so if we take a look at, what kind of comprises that garden? Well, it's your landscape. I guess, / garden. So in that kind of yard, landscape, your garden, usually you will have maybe some trees, shrubbery, which, we kind of used to think of landscape as mostly trees and shrubs, right. Maybe a few perennial flowers. But kind of in the broader sense of a garden, we got kind of the landscaping, the trees, the shrubs, but perennials, more flowers to kind of give it that, that kind of sense of a garden. For example, one of my favorite movies that we always watch with the kids is The Secret Garden. Okay. You ever watch that movie?
I never have,
The Secret Garden. And of course, the garden isn't where they had the broccoli out there. Yeah. The garden was this wonderfully landscaped. And of course, the secret part was it was kind of in a wall that had been all covered with vines. And there was like a hidden door. But the garden, the secret garden, was a very beautiful, well-landscaped setting. So, of course, how do we get kind of that idea out of our head and down into our yard so it actually works? I mentioned looking at magazines or websites.
Pinterest.
Exactly. Yep. To kind of get some other ideas and to borrow from here and there and say, I kind of like this. Maybe I like the looks of like an old-fashioned English cottage garden. Maybe it'd be fun to have that in the front yard. Or maybe I want a landscape with fruit plantings and include those in. Maybe there are certain types of perennials that I see in this spot, and I'd like some of that. So you start kind of gathering these ideas of what you want. And then, of course, it's important to get these ideas on paper. It's actually become easier to kind of get these things on paper because what you can do is some of these ideas that you've got, print them off. Cut them out, print them off, stick them on a paper, and all of a sudden you start kind of formalizing the look you'd like on paper.
So you're kind of laying it out
laying it out
on the page.
Just to kind of start trying to get these vague concepts of what you want to look like, to actually trying to get something down on paper, kind of that look that you'd like your landscape to, or your garden to look like. And of course, in a little bit, we can talk about there are some kind of definite do's and don'ts in kind of creating that. So anyway, that's the concept. But at a certain point, a person is going to have to start kind of measuring out your area and actually drawing what we call a landscape plan. I guess we could call it your garden plan also. But at a certain point, you need to measure up your space. So you will know how many plants and things that I can fit into that area, and start actually identifying some plants that would go into that.
So when you're doing that, you do, because a lot of times we'll see this when you're around people who do this for a living, landscapers or people at garden centers, they'll bring out the gridded paper, right? And then so it's very, very precise. For the average gardener, should they be that precise, or is it okay just to kind of have a rough idea? Or
you can be that precise, but in a simple way.
Yeah.
And when I say in a simple way, if you've got a certain area kind of alongside your lot that you want to add perennials and some nice shrubbery and make it look nice, to measure that area, both the length and the width, that'll give you a very good idea of how many plants you can fit in. So, and it does help to kind of put it on a graph paper. You wouldn't have to, but the main thing is to actually do the measurement. That will help greatly, and you'll be able to kind of get a much better feel, more clear as to how many plants you can put in that area.
And certainly if you have different size plants, like you're saying, if you have a shrub, that's most likely going to take up so much more space than planting tulip bulbs.
So really, the next step beyond getting the ideas kind of in is actually finding out how much space you do have in the area. You could do an entire lot plan of your lot, and sometimes you can probably do a Google map type thing and get a pretty good idea of your lot from that.
So when you're doing this kind of this plan, let's say you're doing it on the graph paper, should people start with the idea of like colors and space, and like I want to see something green, big and green back here, or before they go in and they find, they look at the flowers or plants that really looks appealing. I'm wondering because you've talked about this before a number of times. An important thing to do is to know your soil, and also to consider probably the elevation of your land. If something's a little lower laying and it may hold water more so than higher. Like, should people start with these kind of, again, more vague ideas of like, I'd like to see big pops of color here, here, and here, and then go looking for those things?
Exactly. Yeah. You get kind of the idea of what you want it to look like. You've measured it up so you know how many plants you'll be able to fit in. And then you start looking to see, okay, what will grow locally in our soil types, our climate types? What plants will suit that idea that I'm trying to create? So maybe if it's a national magazine or a national site, the plants that they mention may not grow here,
right?
Or in our soil, in our climate, our winter conditions. So then you can go to the garden centers and say, I'm looking for an evergreen that I want to get about 6 feet high. I'm going to plant 3 of them, 6 feet high for some screening.
Mm-hmm. So you've got a good purpose there.
Right. You've got the purpose. You've got kind of the style and the size. And then you can go to the local garden centers and ask, okay, what have you got that will fit this size? What type of evergreen will grow here that will accomplish this look that I'm trying to get? And so you can do that with each of the plants that will create that look. For example, if you want spreading ground covers kind of in the front, you can go to the garden center and say, hey, I need these ground covers to accomplish this look. What have you got that will grow well in my climate?
So we're talking about you mentioning ground covers and mentioning 6-foot evergreens. And if we're laying something out on graph paper with a grid, we're kind of taking an aerial look and looking down. And obviously height in gardens is very important. Should we also be doing sketches to kind of get an idea for layering as far as like the height levels?
And that's probably the biggest challenge in landscaping or creating this garden in your space. The biggest challenge is, okay, when you start kind of jotting things down on paper, the biggest challenge is trying to see in your head, visualize in your head, what is this going to look like? I can see it on paper, I can see the dimensions. I can kind of draw in some plants that I'd like. And maybe I've gone to the garden center and found some names of the plants. But how do I look at this paper and how do I see in my head what it looks like three-dimensional? Because on paper, of course, they're all flat. So how do I, in my mind's eye, how do I see, okay, the evergreens that I mentioned are going to be nice, upright pyramids, but this other one's going to be flat. So you have to kind of, and that's why it's important to do a little online searching to see what do these plants actually look like. And then you can even, kind of cut out some pictures and have those along with your plan. So then it's better able to visualize in your head that, oh, sure, I see what those pyramidal evergreens. And now I see, okay, in front of those is going to be these low ground covers. So your flat paper map, your flat paper landscape plan, garden plan, is going to start making some sense, if you follow me. You're going to, in your head, see. You won't just see a flat drawing. You're going to kind of see and visualize the concept you're kind of trying to create. And that's probably the biggest challenge, is making the jump from a flat landscape plan to actually seeing it. Because any landscape plan can look really good on paper, but of course the bottom line is going to look really good in your yard.
I'm curious, do you, when my girlfriend and I, when we've been gardening, a lot of times we'll look to Pinterest and we'll, type in something like cottage garden or shade garden or something like that. And as we come up with these ideas and then, we check it with zones, we check it with our soil quality and things like that. Do you use Pinterest at all?
Oh, absolutely. I love it.
What are
I do so much online searching. I love it. I would not want to go back to the days before the internet for anything. I love it. Oh, gosh. I've written garden columns on thought gardening. Oh. That in the middle of winter, you can mentally go tour Buckingham Palace Gardens, in your head. And so, yeah, for your own space, I can borrow a few ideas from Buckingham Palace Gardens for my own yard, so you look here, you look there, Pinterest, and yeah, you just can start getting some own ideas from online.
So once we have this idea, we have like you saying, we can visualize it in our head and we've mapped it out. And, especially if you're starting from scratch or if you're redoing a section of a bed, you have this idea how it looks. Obviously it's going to take a while to get there. But should we be buying all the plants for that at the same time? Or should we be planting the bigger plants in the back first, or the things, because they're going to be harder to get access to as other things grow in around it?
And of course, we as people are impatient.
Yes.
It's hard. One thing I get a kick out of it, some of the Europeans say it takes several hundred years to make a good garden. And well, of course, some of us don't have 100 years to, fiddle around with it.
Yeah. Do you just see eyes pop and jaws drop when they say that?
So anyway, most of us would like our yard or our garden and landscape to come around a little quicker than having to wait a century or two. So anyway, yeah. So what do we do now? So when you are planning something, basically the first season that you kind of start, now whether you're starting from scratch or adding to, okay, the first season that you add the new material, that material is going to take 1 or 2 years to really get it going. And so, but the time passes quickly. So it teaches us patience. That's part of gardening. And so it really doesn't matter how you stretch it out during that first season. Okay. Yeah, well, maybe just physically you don't want to plant it all right away in May. And of course...
And it's also a big investment.
It's a big investment, so maybe you need to go through the course of a few months, because you can plant spring, summer, and fall. Middle of summer, you need to watch the watering more if we have a hot spell. I wouldn't plant on a 110-degree day, but... the invention of the plastic nursery pot allowed garden centers to have stock on hand all summer. So now, as you mentioned, we can kind of spread that out over the course of one summer. But really, for what you add, the new plantings are going to take 1 to 2 growing seasons to really establish and start to look like much.
Now, when you just out of curiosity, when you bring a plant home, I've been guilty of bringing a plant home and then meaning to get to it and get it in the ground. how long do you, I mean, because you could keep a plant in the plastic container. It's been there for a while, as long as you keep watering it. How long does it take you to get that in the ground usually?
Well, I thought I was the only one that bought material and didn't get it planted that day. But yes, the same way that a garden center can keep that material on hand, you just have to watch the watering. The main thing, though, is don't put it in the garage. When we had our garden center, people would sometimes ask, okay, I bought these plants. I'm not ready to plant them yet. Should I just put them in the garage? And no. At the garden centers, they are out in full sunshine, and they don't want to be in your dim garage. So if you take them home, aren't ready to plant them all, put them in a sunshine, put them in a spot that's maybe not windswept, but put them out in the sunshine. And many garden centers have to water that material maybe every day. So do that. When the top of the soil looks dry, water them well until some drains out the bottom. And yeah, you can keep them almost indefinitely.
Now, again, getting back to like pacing as far as planting out things out. If you were to pace yourself out for, let's say, the growing season, as far as planting, would you want to plant like, I want to have this area not finished because again, it takes a while, but to have things, would you focus on that or would you focus on planting things throughout so that there's little pops of...
I follow you. Yeah. Would you kind of complete one area
Right.
or would you plant a few things in a bigger area? Yeah. Oh, that's a good question. I think I'd probably concentrate. I guess this is what we did at our place when we kind of relocated, is we got one area more finished and then moved to the next area, kind of got that finished. It just gives you a little feeling of accomplishment as you go. So I think I would. If a person can't tackle the whole thing right away, maybe kind of finish sections. That also brings up the good point about small trees. Kind of small decorative trees. Maybe you need them for some screening away from the neighbors. So kind of the order in which you might want to buy and get some of these things established, any of the small decorative trees and shrubs. They take longer to establish than perennial flowers. So you may want to, and they're also more expensive. Yeah. So you may want to get those kind of bought and established and going, and then add in the perennial flowers as you can. And again, if you can kind of get it accomplished over the course of a couple of seasons would be nice.
You as a lifelong gardener, me as a relatively new gardener, I find myself, you go into a garden center, you go to when the NDSU, when they have their plant sale or when different groups are doing plant sales, it's so compelling to want to buy so much. Do you have to keep yourself in check when you go into a garden center from overbuying, not so that they won't get planted, but that just like what you're ready for at that particular time?
Definitely, because it's interesting. You head home with, and I've got a little small pickup, so you head home with a load, and then you think, oh gosh, where am I going to put these now? Because so what's the old saying? My eyes were bigger than my tummy.
Yes, yeah, or bigger than your wallet. Yeah, that can be another one. Luckily my girlfriend will go out, and I'll be like, I'll see so many things I like, and I'll say, oh, that's great, I love that, that's beautiful, that would be great, that fits into our yard. So where would we put it?
But on the other side of the coin, too, a person can buy things you like and then figure out where to plant them. Take up a little more of your lawn and create some beauty that way.
We've talked a little bit about like plants taking, a couple of years to get set in. There's a line I've heard. It's that the first year they sleep, second year they creep, third year they leap, right? So that's when they really, after the third year, you'll really see the big major growth coming in. Are there things to do that in between, like if you've got a shrub, and again, you want to give them space for when they're fully mature, that they're not going to be butting up against each other. But do you do anything in between there? Like I always thought it would be kind of a good idea even just to plant an annual, in the garden. Coleus I love, and for our yard we have a lot of shade, so I will throw coleus in here and there because to me, they're great big pops of color.
Yeah, you see, and that is a great bridge. Well,
bridging is a good word. Okay,
yeah. Well, the perennials and the shrubbery and things are kind of getting established and kind of doing what they need to do to be showy. In the meantime, we can plant annual flowers. Annual flowers, of course, are the type that just grow for one season. We enjoy, petunias, marigolds, the coleus you mentioned, begonias, all the different types. They give season-long color. So you've got something good showing up all season long there. So they're a very good bridge in the meantime while you're waiting for the other things to establish over the course of maybe a couple of summers. Now, you bring up a really important point, and that is giving each of the plants, whether it's a shrub or perennials, giving them the space that they need to grow. Because a very common mistake, and we've all made this, is they look so small when they're in the pot.
Yeah.
And we want it to kind of fill in quick. So we tend to plant too close. And then in a few years, things are overcrowded. They aren't doing as well. Then we need to dig and move and all that. So what I like to do is give each of the plants, whether it's a shrub or a perennial, give it their, what I call the footprint. On the tag, if it says it grows, 2 feet or 3 feet, then give it that whole circle of a footprint. So imagine that. In fact, I've even cut circles of cardboard.
Okay.
1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot, a big 4 foot. And then when I'm kind of planning out a new spot in our yard, like for a perennial flower bed, then I'll use those cardboard circles and say, oh, here, this peony, that needs a 4-foot circle, 3 to 4. And then next to it, I can put this 2-foot iris. And it just helps you visualize so that you give them the footprint that they need to do well and to thrive and not get them overly crowded.
This is kind of not necessarily going off topic, but you're talking about the cardboard. I love that as a kind of a hack. That's a wonderful thing. And it helps you kind of visualize what that space will be. But you also will use cardboard under mulch, right? Instead of what do they call it? Garden cloth. Or
the landscape fabric. Cardboard under wood mulch is my little secret weapon. Okay. So why wouldn't you use landscape fabric like in a perennial garden?
Yeah.
The reason for that is it suppresses the weeds, and then you put the shredded bark over that. But the problem is in a perennial garden, you're constantly changing it. You may want to add some more things. Every so often, you may need to dig and divide. And that landscape fabric is really tough to work with. Also, weeds do tend to blow in seeds, and they'll grow down through that. And so landscape fabric can sometimes be kind of a hassle under that mulch, because then you go to dig and divide a perennial, and you got all this fabric under there that's a little hard to deal with. Cardboard, on the other hand, after you plant your perennials or shrubbery, if you lay down cardboard and right on the ground, right in the soil, and then add the mulch on top of that, at least about 5 inches of mulch, shredded bark mulch, and it'll settle. But that cardboard suppresses the weeds. So even perennial weeds like thistle, and you have to overlap it, otherwise weeds will grow through so overlap it good. And the cardboard will suppress the weeds. And after, maybe 2 or 3 seasons, it will break down naturally into organic. In the meantime, it's pretty well gotten rid of the weeds that were underneath. And then it just makes a really perennial and shrub friendly soil atmosphere.
And then, so because you're talking about like if you have to go in and divvy up or if you want to move something, then do you just kind of find where the cardboard is around it and then just cut all those pieces out?
And it's so easy to, if you want to move a perennial, it's so easy just to cut a little cardboard, and you can even add a little more if you need to. Now, cardboard has been a little bit controversial because it wasn't sure by some other university extensions if that cardboard would create kind of a non-airy atmosphere.
Right.
Because a lot of
and it would certainly hold on to the moisture.
Yeah, it holds on to the moisture beautifully. And they didn't know if that would kind of make more of an area where the air wouldn't exchange as well.
Yeah.
So, but I'm a good test subject. And after four going on 5 years, things grow beautifully in it. So it's worked wonders for me, and many others have used it too. So I'm not noticing any aerified, is that the term maybe? A non-aerified effect. I'm just seeing total good results from cardboard.
So we don't need to do such a deep dive into cardboard, but just out of curiosity, I mean, are you taking boxes and cutting them up, or are you taking newer pieces of cardboard? I'm wondering because you probably want to remove any tape or stickers or things like that that would be harder to break down, right?
Right. It should be non-colored cardboard, just the regular brown. Old boxes cut down.
Stay connected to your community with local news. Get your first 3 months of unlimited access to Inforum.com for only 99 cents a month. Visit Inforum.com/subscribe today for this great offer.
Now, it sounds like it would make sense when you're planting kind of a perennial garden border or a shrub border, such as along the sides of your property. It sounds like it would make sense to, start at the back, put all the tall things in the back, medium things, and then the short things in front. Sounds like that would make sense.
Right.
It kind of does. But that looks a little less dynamic. There's a way that you can kind of add a little bit of fun tension to the planting, and that is bring some of the taller material towards the front.
Okay.
Now, you don't, and I'll try to paint this picture in my head. Okay. So instead of everything tall in the back, bring a few taller things, such as a few taller perennials, up towards the front. Now, you don't hide short things behind that, but if you can mentally kind of picture a few taller things up towards the front, like of a perennial or a shrub area, and what that does is kind of gives that tension where everything isn't in a little row in the front all short. Instead, you got kind of a couple of taller things here and there in the front, and then some even taller things behind that. But it gives kind of this dynamic to the thing, and it doesn't look quite so regimented.
In the past, you've talked about is it a Dutch landscape architect or a Dutch gardener?
Yes.
And he really was promoting the idea of and we're guilty of this too in our yard. And this is something that we're looking to change. So I'm looking to get some input, some suggestions on this, but just to not have straight lines that go parallel with the property or go parallel with the house or go parallel with the garage, which we've done. They're simple beds. It's probably a great way to start with, but now we're looking at, we want to bump that out. We want to have a little curve in there. And for something like that, where you can bring out a taller perennial, put it in kind of the point of that curve or the front of that curve, it would be really nice. Or maybe even sometimes some kind of an ornamental grass or something like that, where it wouldn't block everything out, but you could see other things through it.
Yeah. And you mentioned that Dutch landscape architect.
I can't remember his name.
Yeah, his name is Piet Oudolf.
Okay.
And he's currently probably the world's most famous person, and he's got some really neat ideas. He's designed these famous gardens all over the world, including the United States. And so he very carefully places plants so that they kind of have this, I call it a dynamic tension in it, kind of just a fun thing. And part of that is that you have different shapes, different forms. He uses a lot of ornamental grass because, like that ornamental grass, when it's in a planting, it's kind of waving in the wind, and you kind of get this movement throughout. And then you don't have all the things just in neat rows. You have kind of things that are taller, kind of in the front, not totally, but so yeah, you kind of create these. I don't know, I guess you call it this creative tension within the area, and it just makes it look really neat.
And you can also, that way, you can also divvy up areas into space or into spots almost easier than if you're just doing straight lines of things, where you can have, a focal point where it's a little taller or a little bit bigger or spills out a little bit more. Exactly.
Those are great ideas. The other thing that Piet Oudolf emphasizes is we have 4 seasons. Let's landscape for 4 seasons. And he made a statement that at first I thought, huh? And that is, we need to learn to love brown. And after it sunk in, and I've seen lots of photos, in the fall of the year, after frost, we start getting a lot of brown, kind of beautiful, kind of subtle shades of brown, dark brown, light brown, colors thrown in, the reds and oranges of fall, yellows. And all of a sudden you have this wonderful fall look. And so that's a wonderful third season, spring, summer, fall, third season. So we can learn to love that. So I leave all of the above ground portions on in our perennial garden because in the fall of the year, even after frost, I've learned to appreciate the shapes of all the different perennials in brown. And then, of course, that leads us on to the fourth season, winter. Now, of course, this winter, everything's so low, so deep under snow, I can't see any of this stuff. But in many winters, when you can see the bare shrubs, some of them colorful twigs, such as red twig dogwood, but even perennials, even though there are different shades of brown, perennials against the white snow are beautiful. The ornamental grasses that are waving in the winter, I was going to say breeze, but in the winter it's wind. But, and the different seed heads that are still on, there's a lot of beauty. You look out your window onto some of these landscapes, the garden, and there's a lot of beauty to be had there. So I've really come to appreciate through some of the designers like Pete Outolf, I've really come to appreciate that we don't just have spring and summer. We have 4 seasons of beauty. Do
you know the local photographer, John Borghi?
Yes.
Yeah, he does great shots of things in the winter where, where you have this winter attraction where it's a plant that's probably dormant, but, he sees this kind of the shadows are great for that. And then, the contrast between the sparkling white and then the stem of whether it's a hydrangea or natural grasses, something like that. It's really fun. What things would you plant? Let's start with what things would you plant for spring interest? Because we think of maybe daffodils and tulips.
Yep. Spring bulbs that come on up. They're a classic that should really be in. And peonies for late May, early June. Peonies to me are a must because they last so very long. So in our perennial gardens, we should have some things that are long-lived skeletons to form a backbone. Okay, peonies is one. Iris for June blossom. Iris are just beautiful. They're winter hardy, tough. Every 4 years or so you need to kind of dig and divide. But iris are so sturdy and beautiful. Even when they aren't blooming, the sword-shaped leaves are very really beautiful in a perennial garden landscape. So those are a must. Daylilies. Daylilies are a must because there are so many hybrid daylilies now. They aren't grandma's old daylilies that we didn't like because they were kind of weedy looking.
Right.
The new hybrids are so beautiful. I've got one called Spider-Man, a bright red, and there's one called Buttered Popcorn. That the blossoms are huge and they're bright yellow with kind of a whitish and buttered popcorn, very descriptive. And of course for a shaded area, hosta, bleeding heart, things such as that. And then
bleeding heart's also always a good spring. You get some spring color there too, don't you?
And of course, then I kind of wandered into summertime. The daylilies, of course, are in midsummer.
Yep.
And then when we go, and there are many good midsummer blooming perennials. The regular true lilies are beautiful. And of course, as we get into the fall, there are the fall asters that bloom right up through frost and fall chrysanthemums. And so one of the key points in developing this landscape garden is to provide things that are happening each of those seasons.
Yeah.
So spring blooming things, summer blooming things, fall blooming things that have decorative seed or structure in each of the different seasons.
When you think of fall, one of the big things is mums. Are there any mums that are perennial up here, or are they all?
Yeah, mums tend to freeze out if it's just the run-of-the-mill mum. Yeah. But there are some really good mums that were developed at University of Minnesota, and those are called the Mammoth series.
Okay.
Mammoth series. Another good one is called the Min series. Like there's Min Autumn, Min Yellow.
Min for Minnesota?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yep. Min Gopher, Min Ruby. And so the Min series, MINN series, and the Mammoth series are very winter hardy. They would still like some cover, a little bit of leaves in the fall and in a spot that catches good snow cover. But mums are one of the most beautiful fall blooming perennials.
As for spring, when we were talking about spring, one of the spring colors and the spring, something I never noticed before I owned a home, and we didn't even have one, but then we would drive around, we would look at yards and try to get ideas. Forsythia. It's one of the first real big pops of yellow, isn't it?
And you see, now that's a good example of how we blend shrubbery into the whole mix.
Yeah.
Perennials, shrubbery. Yeah, forsythias are the earliest blooming, really, of the shrubs. Azaleas and rhododendrons. There are some developed in Minnesota, and NDSU has got some rhododendron varieties working on. And forsythia, azalea, rhododendron. But forsythia is, very nicely hardy. There are a couple of northern developed types. And forsythia, even before the leaves come out, the flowers come out.
Yeah.
And so beautiful. That's a good way to get some very vibrant color in early spring.
Yeah, early on when your yard is maybe still a little muddy.
Yeah,
and
the snow barely leaves and the forsythia start blooming.
How tall do they get?
Depending on the variety, but the varieties that are winter hardy for North Dakota and Minnesota will get up to 5 feet or so. Okay,
so they can be pretty substantial.
Yep. And yeah, exactly.
But they're not like a big woody stem one, are they? I mean, they obviously they have a stem, but they don't grow into like big trunks or anything like that.
Exactly. Yeah, they're more of a very multi-branched shrubbery. And also forsythia, they can be pruned way, way back and let them regrow, and they bloom great again on fresh wood.
We have I don't want to turn this into a kind of a testing ground just for my yard, but I'm going to use my yard as an example. So we have a 6-foot wood fence around the perimeter of the backyard. And we do that because we have dogs. And so we started planting. And again, we planted like kind of parallel with that, right along the line. But then we realized, the yard would be more interesting if we bumped that out and made these curvy lines. And one of the other things that occurred to me is that, especially on the south side of the yard where the fence is, and when the sun rather is high overhead in summer, there's still about maybe 2 or 3 feet of shade that's cast off that fence that it never really comes out of the shade. But I thought, if we bump out some of that area and extend the garden more into the yard into the north, that area will get sun. And I never really thought about that one part of a garden could be in multiple zones as far as like getting full sun, partial shade we can do different things like that too. You can be creative in your yard and how you do that to get some different plants in there.
And sometimes until we actually stand out in our yard and observe, sometimes we don't always know exactly how much sunlight does an area get. So when you go to the garden center and start picking out plants and the label says full sun, part sun, shade, sometimes we don't really know, is that area, is it full sun or part sun? So I always mention that for all of us, we should go stand out in that spot in the morning and at noon, if you can, maybe on a weekend, morning, noon, and then afternoon. And see how much sunlight are you actually getting, actually sunshine. So now if a plant label says this plant requires full sun, it should have 6 to 8 hours of direct sunshine on that spot. If that spot only gets maybe 4 to 6 hours, then when the label says part sun or part shade, then if something is only getting half a day of sunshine, then you would choose that type of plant. If you're getting 4 hours of sunshine or less in a spot, then it's considered shade. Okay. Sometimes like on the north side of something, you'll get a little maybe morning sun shining down in, maybe a little afternoon sun angles in, but very important to eye up that area so you know whether to choose shade sun or part sun.
I try to go out and take pictures too, and then that way I can look side by side and see, kind of throughout the year again too. How is it going to change? And, that may change too if you're dealing with trees. Trees sometimes have to go away, and so that can always change. But yeah, with the fence, that was been one of the things that I noticed. It kind of changed some of the dynamic of the yard. One kind of quick way around some of that, I figured out to add some color, is that on the uprights of the posts, finding an angle to put a hanging basket out.
Sure.
And then you can have some great color there. And,
Yeah, good idea.
Again, as soon as you plant those in the basket, the color's already there. It's you don't have to, and it'll grow more, but you do have that instant pop that's rewarding.
Exactly. That brings up another good point too, especially during the early years, the first couple of years when maybe the other things aren't well established, is adding containers of annual flowers out in that area because they could get kind of that instant color and give you a season-long color also. So containers or hanging baskets out in that area.
Yeah, and hanging baskets either on shepherd's hooks or on a post or on a garage or something like that. And it also adds a little bit of height too, doesn't it? So that you're not always looking ground level. You're not always looking down. You can
it gives that dynamic and height change.
That's really fun to see, isn't it?
It is.
So Don, what kind of pointers do you have for people who want to kind of improve their yard, or if they just want to kind of bring it up a little bit more or do a little bit more with it? What are some things that they can do?
Because many of us have things that are already existing, but there are ways that we can kind of improve. And these same guidelines can be used even if you're starting from scratch. And of course, one of the keys to developing your landscape, your garden, is that the front door of your home should be the focal point. So, you're developing your garden, your landscaping, but still your home is the key to your lot. And so the front door should be a focal point. So maybe put some flowering containers by it, some colorful shrubs by it, so that when people look at your lot, the eye should be funneled to the front door because that makes the whole thing look welcoming. So do keep in mind the house in this whole setting too. And as part of that, try not to plant things in the front yard that are going to block the house, because of course the house should be visible and welcoming. So maybe don't plant a tree right smack dab in the front. Boulevards are fine, but in the front yard, too close to the house, don't obscure the house with a decorative tree right smack dab in front. Keep the decorative trees maybe off to the side so we can still enjoy looking at your nice house.
And does that mean kind of also too, like, don't crowd things, like don't have big bushes on either side of the walkway or things like that?
Yeah,
things
exactly.
Can get out of hand.
Yeah, that kind of make it look kind of more ominous.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We're not going for the Victorian great expectations.
Yeah, exactly. And now you mentioned curving lines, and that's one very important key to keep in mind when you're developing your garden, your landscape, your planting beds, to use curving lines. They just look so much more natural. And if you have areas that are just straight, you can extend them and put a curving line. Now, the ways that I like to develop those is using either a garden hose, flexible garden hose, to lay those out, or even an extension cord. You can kind of play with those lines and get a nice sweeping curve that you would like, kind of massage them until you get the look you like. And then with spray paint, spray a line, and then you'll know where to cut the lawn out. Another thing that's important is to plant in odd numbers. That sounds kind of crazy, but in many perennials, they just look better in a grouping. You get a little more mass when they are blooming, but it's important to use odd numbers because in nature, that seems to look good. Instead of looking so square and blocky, if you use odd numbers when you're planting groups of things, that always works well. And to avoid too much symmetry. So when a person is looking at a house, if you're developing kind of a landscape garden around that, we don't need to have each half of the house looking the same.
Yeah.
Instead, you need balance. You need some balance on both sides, but we don't need exact mirror images on both sides. That can be kind of tough because if something dies on that side and it's still living on that side, it's going to throw the scheme out of whack.
Yeah, so repetition is one thing, and it's a great tool, something to use. But like you're saying, just having identical, it's a bit maybe
more for Buckingham Palace.
Yes, exactly. That's a little too manicured.
That kind of look, exactly. And also when we're trimming our shrubbery to keep them kind of in bounds into shape, to avoid shearing them tightly. Instead, kind of selectively trim back branches as you need to maintain your landscape. That sheared tight look is good for a formal hedge. That's pretty, but it can make shrubbery look unnatural. So unless you're doing the Disney World pruning them into shapes, it's better not to do that tight shearing. But
and you can also really damage.
Yeah, you can do a lot of damage with an electric hedge trimmer on those. And also to keep the edges neat and clean. The edges of planting beds, they look crisp and clean. Of course, you'll probably want to put in edging. I like brick edging, recycled brick edging. I love that as an edge along the planting beds.
Okay.
There are all kinds of edging types.
People use rocks sometimes.
Yep, rocks. There are concrete edging that a person can put in. Those look nice and neat. But it's important to have that edge look nice and crisp and clean. Then the whole landscape just looks well cared for. And again, to make sure that you don't crowd things. From the onset, give them their footprint that they need to develop when choosing plants.
Well, Don, this has been a lot of fun. I know that me as a newer gardener, I really appreciate hearing some ideas and being able to talk to somebody about ideas for the garden and developing new space and improving on what we have.
You know, it's fun because it's a process. It really, with our yards, garden, landscape, we're never really done. You know, I mean, you want to get to a point where you can sit back and enjoy it. But a part of the fun is the process and seeing it develop. And in time, you change a little of this, change a little of that as you need. And it's a very fun process to watch these plants develop.
Well, I appreciate this so much. And we talked about doing flower and shrub gardens here. I think we could probably sometime talk about planting a vegetable garden.
Yeah, because, it's funny. And there's beauty in a vegetable garden. Sure. I love I love the look of our vegetable garden. But yeah, the same type of thing. There's so much planning that can go into that. You know, what to plant, where to plant it, to make sure you get as much as you can out of a vegetable garden.
And in vegetable gardens, you may not want to go with the curvy lines. You may want to stick with a straight regimented
Well, I'm
lines.
German. The vegetable garden has to be in straight lines.
So, Don, if people have questions, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Best way is to email me, and that is donald.kinzler@ndsu.edu. I'll give that one more time with the spelling. And that's donald.kinzler, spelled Kinzler @ndsu.edu.
Well, that's it for another week of Gardening Together. Growing Together, a gardening podcast. I'm John Lamb.
Don Kinzler.
And we'll talk to you again.